Welcome to this episode of the Nerds of the North podcast. My name is Matt. This is episode number 29 of the podcast. I'm going to be real honest. I'm a little bit drunk this episode, but let's go. So yeah, today we don't necessarily have anything media based to be talking about in terms of Marvel, Star Wars, Disney, or anything. Because it's a little bit of a slow period. And so we're going to be talking more about our personal experiences. This episode of the podcast is going to be relatively short. We're saying 30 minutes, but it'll probably be 3 hours. We'll see. It's going to be mostly about our religious experiences, kind of our backgrounds in terms of where we came from, where we are, and what led us to be where we are presently, which is very intermixed because Nick had experiences and my experience, I had experiences and Nick's experience. It's all over the place. So that being said, that's just the intro of this episode. I am host number one, Matt, as always. And as always, host number two is...
Today, I'm Nick.
He is Nick, just today though. So yeah, I guess where do you want to start with this, Nick? Where we agreed that we wanted to speak about our experiences,
kind
of with like our religious backgrounds, where that
I think it would be a good place to start, just kind of going over like our background and where we are currently with our I guess faith, essentially. I think this is going to be a really interesting podcast, and it's definitely something that we haven't done before. And I think, honestly, this would be a good one to share. I think I would be proud, maybe, hopefully, to share something like this, because it's something that I think is really interesting, especially when you hear our stories and how we ended up where we are. I think this conversation could be pretty interesting. So,
agreed.
So I think maybe give a little bit of a background of where you are and where you came from in religion, in Christianity in particular, I suppose.
So I was born in a log cabin.
Are you Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah, no. All right, so I guess if we're gonna go all the way back, so my parents, my father was raised Catholic, and then more or less, I think a phrase I would use would be defected to Christianity, more for his marriage than anything. My mom was raised Christian by my grandfather. She was adopted, and so she more or less absorbed the religious tendencies of him. So when they met, it was over a Super Bowl party. My dad was mostly Catholic at that point. They met, and that's kind of more when the transition towards traditional Christianity began. And so upon them being married, it was a Christian religion. My mother had come from a previous marriage with 2 children, in which she had also been Christian in that reality, or in her life, previous life. My dad had been part of a previous marriage. He was he has not revealed many details of that part of his life, but he didn't have any children from that previous marriage. So where I come into play is being born from a mostly Christian family. So my sister and I, we both come from a mostly Christian, or from an entirely Christian background. And I'm trying to think of more specifically, like in terms of Christian background, like the very open-ended Christian background. Like it was a group that was non-denominational. We started from a Baptist church when we first moved to the great state of Montana. We had moved from California to Montana, and we just started going to this particular church because of what was it was what was available at the time. I think more than anything.
And that's Harvest Church, correct?
No, that was actually, we initially started going to a church on the West End. It was, I know the location of this church almost exactly. Shoot, what was it? I think, like, was it Broadwater? Yeah, it was Broadwater and and then like a numbered cross street. Like, I want to say like Broadwater, like 45th. It was a
Okay.
Baptist church out that direction. But that was where we initially started going. That's where we first started going to church. After that, Harvest Church opened up, and that's when I started going there. And I was still pretty young when that started happening. And I was a practicing Christian up until about my freshman, sophomore year of high school. And I think, like a lot of people who grew up in religious households, I was the type of person who was like relatively sheltered in that regard and haven't really considered any other possibilities in terms of religious beliefs or otherwise. I just hadn't really thought about it. I believed what my parents said, and that was largely the end of it. And
As all children tend to do.
as most children tend to do, yeah. And so in this context, I started reading more outside of like the religious bubble, and in particular, like, love it or hate it, like my religious journey where it began and ended was with Ayn Rand in terms of literature. Like freshman, sophomore year of high school, I remember this so clearly. I needed to read a book for English class, and I was running out of options and time. And I just found a book that was like, yeah, sure, I'm going to read. I was looking through the list of what was available, and Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead is what I landed upon. And I consumed that book in like a 2-week period, just read it so fast. And it very intensely changed the direction of like how I looked at the world for myself and for like a friend of mine at the time too. But it like really directly changed how we looked at the world, and that has had a very direct result on how my religious journey has changed from there. But in addition to that, Nick and I, this guy, in my point of view, maybe is this guy in this point of view, but like Nick and I spoke extensively about religion in our younger years. Like, I remember us very particularly like in our backyards, pre-fences, just like tossing football, like a football to each other, a Nerf football, purple, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. It had like the green thing.
Yeah, it had like the 2 rings on it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I remember that. Weird.
You and I would toss that football to each other and just talk about like the world and religion and everything in between. Like, that was a thing that we did pretty frequently as young men. And that, in addition to my expanding my literary experience, really led to my accepting that I didn't really think that Christianity was necessarily the thing for me. Present day, I consider myself more of an atheist. I'm not even going to say more of an atheist. I'm an atheist. That's just how it is. Like, I have issues with the church in general, just with religion in general, in terms of how it treats people, and love it or hate it, that's kind of where I'm at. But that's where I'm at currently. I consider myself an atheist. I come from a, like, I wouldn't say staunchly religious background, but like both of my parents were religious, and they raised me in a way that would reflect that. And I don't regret that upbringing at all. I think I'm a better person because of it, but because of where I've landed, I take that religious background and I just apply it to a more non-religious path forward. So that's where I find myself personally.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Matt. I think
Of
that's
course.
very, I mean, I think my relationship with you growing up definitely impacted what my view of religion was growing up, for better or worse, for sure. But I guess just to give a background of where I'm coming from personally, um, I personally, of course, personally, I converted to Christianity, which is a weird thing for me to say. Like, I never thought that would be something that would come out of my mouth. Um, but I did this about 2 years ago, and it was just a number of things that sort of built up on each other. Um, I was just really disenfranchised with where Portland was at. I was angry with what I was seeing, and I thought, as an act of rebellion, I was going to start going to church. And so I got on my computer and I'm like, show me a nearby church. And so uh, at the time, I went there with my then fiance. We went to a church called Door of Hope, which was based out of Revolution Hall in Southeast Portland. And it was just a few months before they moved to another building off of Belmont in Portland, which is where I'm most familiar with the place now. But yeah, so I started going there, and like I've it was a weird experience for me. Like, I'd been to church a few times, I think, with Matt's family, but really it only been a few times in my life. And there's always was something kind of calling me to faith, but definitely during my college years, I was very anti-religion. Definitely anti-religion. Um, I will say I was never a fan of Bill Maher, though. I thought that movie was stupid. So, but just focusing in here again. So, yeah. So there was like something that happened. Like my fiance and I, we split up. I just remember in that moment I was completely lost. It was a really terrible moment in my life. Like, I was like, where do I go? I'm in Portland. I don't know anyone except for my friend from Montana. Like, I'm completely alone. And I'm like, I'm just a few blocks away from the church. I'm just gonna walk to the church. And this was when I had moved to Belmont. And so I was walking, like, I still remember this, like, you know, I was pretty much didn't know where I was in tears. And I walked into the church and I went and sat down, and the band was practicing. And it was Evan Way, the lead of the band there. And he like walked over to me and he's like, "Are you okay, man?" And I'm pretty sure he thought I was a homeless person, perhaps. I don't know. And I'm like, "No, man, I told him what happened." And like he walked me over to this sort of more secluded area and he prayed over me. And uh, I wasn't a Christian at that point. Definitely was not, but it was definitely something that I needed to tell someone.
Sure.
And that was where I turned to. And then the Sunday after that, I went and talked to Josh White, who's the lead pastor at that church. And I talked to him quite a few times over the course of like a few months. And still remember this moment where he was like, at the end of his sermon, he's like, I just want, if there's anyone out there that like wants to like, you know, talk to Jesus or turn to Jesus or become a Christian, or I can't remember the exact words, like, I want you to raise your hand. And like, there's several people that raised their hand before me, and then I finally did. And he's like, I see that, and I knew. I still remember that moment where he like said that, and it was interesting. And then later, after I got to know Josh a little bit more, he actually asked me to speak in front of the church and just kind of tell him my story. And that was right before COVID hit. But as time's gone on and like I've become more involved with that church and just the community, like, I've just felt myself realizing how much I agree with just who Christ is and what he represents, and it's just this overwhelming sense of love for humanity. And which is weird for me saying, just knowing my background and even the conversations I used to have with Matt about specifically, I think, predetermination and how I didn't really understand some of the stuff that dealt with like hell and heaven, which I still struggle with. But yeah, so that's my background a little bit. So I don't know, Matt, like what are your thoughts at the moment?
I mean, I don't know. Like, in that we're kind of going to be a little bit just, all over the place with this podcast in terms of where we're going. I know that in particular, I remember very specifically going to, so I, in journey and being a Christian and then not being a Christian, I've had a number of friends who attempted to have their influence on me. Their heart's in the right place. They wanted to speak to me about God and things of that nature. I went to a particular church or a youth group gathering. I remember this very specifically. And I remember they had that particular night that I went, it was like God had ordained it. Where you could write a question on a note card and then turn it in, and then they would discuss what was on the note card.
You've told me this story before, and this is all my fault, isn't it?
This is 100% your fault. 100% your fault, because it's something that resonated with me, and this was the thing that I think was really important to ask. But at the time, I was like, I'm going to ask this question, and if memory serves, the question was more or less, like, God creates people whom they know that are going to be sinners, or that people that aren't going to be redeemed. So why does God create these people? And if so, like, why does he create them in the first place? So
I think the real question that is, when God creates someone, he knows whether they're going to go to hell or not.
Yes.
And how is this totally morally justifiable? It's something to that to that point.
More specifically that regard. No, thank you.
Yeah.
And so that's the question that I wrote on the card was God creates people that they know are going to go to heaven or hell because they are omniscient. So why does God create people that they know are going to go to hell? Yeah, that's actually, no, thank you for that clarification. I appreciate that. So I turned in this note card into this, this is a youth group experience. So like the oldest end of this group of people is 17 years old. And I think at the time I was maybe have been 15, 16. So I turned in this card. I'm just a guest at this gathering. This is not a group of people I generally spend time with. And I'm looking at the front, like I am a relatively observant person. And so looking at the front, there is one note card being passed around between multiple youth group leaders at this point. And I'm like, I know exactly what note card they're passing around. And again, comes to the point where they're announcing the winners of like whose cards have been pulled, and my card has been one that's been pulled, and they don't have an answer. They think it's a great question, but they have fuck all in terms of answers. They don't have anything for this question, and I don't blame these people for not having an answer to this question, but I think it is a borderline unanswerable question in terms of, your bog standard, Christian religion. But like that's a memory for me that sits very sternly in my memory as a non-believer, is that this was a group of people who should have had all the answers for a young man like me at the time. Like, this is a group of people between, like 13, 14 years old all the way up to 17, that, like, if a question like this comes across their bow, they should maybe perhaps have a proper answer for, but these people didn't have an answer for it. And to this day, I don't think there's necessarily a great answer for this question.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
Mhm.
And I definitely think if you asked that of my pastor, he probably would have an answer to it. I don't know if it'd
Sure.
be a satisfactory answer for you, but
Yeah. I mean,
I definitely think that that's a particularly hard question to answer. And I think a lot of it comes down to what you believe, like with predetermination and free will, and what you think hell is. And I think I think a lot of what we think hell is has been influenced a lot by like Dante's Inferno, you know, like we tend to think of hell as a particular way in the West, and I don't know if that's what hell actually is. I don't know if it's some place where you're thrown into for eternity because you tied your shoelaces wrong one day and accidentally fell over and pushed someone into traffic. I don't know, but like I don't think that's what it is. And
sure.
if you look at what Jesus actually said about forgiveness, um, I still struggle with what is justifiable and what's not justifiable. But I tend to think what I actually think hell is. I think it's something where God, I think C.S. Lewis said this, it's where God gave you what you wanted. Like I think what we want tends to be really bad for us. And so I think what it is, it's a world or a state of being where God has basically just said, okay, if that's what you want, here it is. And I think it's torture. You know, it's like that stupid Matrix thing. I don't know if you remember. It was like, well, we made 6 worlds before this, or tons of matrices before this, and they were all paradises or something. But everyone just hated it so much. But I don't. That's a stupid analogy. I don't know where I'm going with that.
No, I don't. I
But
would say I don't think that's necessarily a stupid analogy. I think that it feels like, regardless of who is answering the question, whether it be a deity considered good, whether it be God, Jesus, Holy Trinity in that realm, or Satan in that realm, Satan, Hades, however you want to look at it. I think every version of this is a monkey's paw. It's like they give you some version of what they think is right, but in giving in your deepest darkest desires, you're giving in to a deity who wants to be proven right one way or the other. It's kind of like the story of Job in a way. Like, the story of Job is one of a believer who, like, regardless of what's thrown at him, that his faith is being tested. But at the end of the day, I think regardless of what he wished for or what he didn't want, was going to just be the result. Like, I don't think that there was going to be a version of that ended well for him, because one way or the other, one deity or the other was going to make his life miserable. Like, I don't really think that either of these beings had Job's best interest at heart. And I think that at the end of the day, like, gods have no interest in what's actually best for the mortal at the end of the day. Like, their own interests are at heart on these topics.
Yeah, and I guess this probably isn't a great answer and something that maybe you wouldn't agree with. And these are questions I think that non-believers and believers have, like
Mhm.
about what God really, I guess, what does he really care if he's willing to put this man through this? Um,
Mhm.
but I think at the end of the day, like what I would argue is that it's a very narrow view of what life or what we are. And I think I mean, that is hammered into the whole Bible, especially like the New Testament, is like there's something beyond just this life. And just like as humans, we're really focused on worldly things. And that isn't what we should be focused on. And I think that's what the Job is about. It's like it's not about the world. It's not about being happy and having plenty of things. It's about having faith in the Lord and knowing, I guess, that he's there and that he is present, so I'm not a biblical scholar, and I'm not going to pretend that I know this. This is just what I'm gathering from the story. And the New Testament
Mhm.
is definitely different than the Old Testament in a lot of ways. Not that the Old Testament isn't correct, but yeah, those are challenging questions. And I think I know what a lot of people in church would say, or a lot of the pastors, like the whole Old Testament is looking forward to Jesus. And so, yeah, I would need to reread the book of Job to really, and probably read thousands of pages of analysis of this book to really tell you like a good counter argument to what you're saying and stuff. So
I mean, I think I mean, I think there's a reason why it's so challenging for people to understand, in that, like, mortals versus deities, if we're going to be making this distinction, have different expectations of what the end result is going to be in terms of the mortal existence. Um, like, I mean, I think Job is a good example, only in that, like, Job is a good example in that there's a bet going on between two deities. And I think, if you're going to be framing it that way, that deities like have reason to be having bets over the lives of mortals in which they have no stake in. Like in the comparison of the story of Job between God versus Satan, or the devil, in Christian philosophy, like they have no horse in this race, one way or the other. Like, they're determining the existence of one man and his faith in just God, like no one else. And and in that particular context, Job he succeeds in his trial. But I don't think that's the norm necessarily. And I don't think it's necessarily fair for deities, God, devil, whomever, Dionysus versus Artemis. I don't care one way or the other. But, like, I don't think it's necessarily fair for deities to be gambling on the lives of mortals one way or the other. And it's a reason why I don't necessarily believe in gods one way or the other, is that, like, I just think that, like, it's for their own entertainment more than anything. And if it's going to be for some, like, god's entertainment, why would I want to feed into that versus just live my life the way that I think that I should?
yeah, I mean, that's a good argument, Matt. And I would almost take it from the stance of like the context that the story came from. I mean, this story wasn't written to make people dislike God, right? That wasn't why it's in the Bible. It's a very
No.
clear point, and the point is that having faith is more important than worldly things, I think. And yeah, I don't know, like I'd have to read it again, or I think I've read it before, but I don't think it's supposed to make God look petty. I think it's just supposed to be like, yeah, like he had it all, and look at this man, he's so great, like he's maintained his faith through this all. Like you think of these people that were the context where the story came out of, it's like these are people that probably lived really challenging lives in a lot of ways. I mean, we still do. Um, and the story must have been a comfort to them on some level. So just
I
knowing,
mean, in
yeah.
the story of Job, though, like he is a man that has everything,
Hmm.
more or less. Like the whole reason that Satan, the devil, in this context, challenges God in his belief is that if everything's taken away from him, would he still be a believer? And ultimately, Job comes up positive in that regard. Like everything is taken away from him, his family, his money, his livestock, like everything's taken away from him. And yet, regardless of that, he still believes in God. He still his bedrock is God. And so in that regard, like the story is a net positive in terms of like in Job, in terms of God, in terms of his belief being rewarded in some sort of meaningful way. But like why did God didn't have to just be subservient to the devil in this way and just be like, oh yeah, let's just fuck over a disciple of mine just for the sake of a bet. He has every ability to show that Job is a devout follower, but in the context of the story, in context of how the Bible tells it, this is a story in which God is like, oh yeah, let's just put one of my disciples on point and see, oh yeah, sure, maybe he'll be a believer. I'll put money on that. Like the fact that a God like that is willing to just put one of his people in the spotlight, to put one of his people on the spot like that, isn't necessarily indicative of God being good. It's indicative of God being like, yeah, I'd put money on that. And like, what does he have to lose if he loses? Oh, this one disciple of mine is a bad person. Oops.
Yeah, I think it's also worth pointing out too that the book of Job is, I guess, the oldest book in the Bible that was written. So,
Sure.
and I don't have all the answers for you, Matt, but I think again, it's just reiterating the importance of faith. And I don't have, I don't know. So, but
Yeah, no,
yeah.
and I'm gonna be entirely honest with you. Like my questioning of all this isn't necessarily one where I'm looking for answers. It's not something that I'm looking at you and going, Nick, tell me what I want to know. That's not what I'm looking for out of this conversation.
Yeah.
It's one that like this is something that I've believed for a long time, or that the lack of belief, perhaps, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, no, I guess that probably would be the most. I think we could go a lot of different directions, but I think maybe this is the first time we've done something like this. Maybe the best way, and in regards to trying to keep it shorter too, like maybe just kind of going into what you believe now and like what that means for you. Like what do you feel about that? Like how, just what do you believe now? Like,
Sure. No, I think shortly that I think that the fact that the world has turned out the way that it has, Earth, the people, lions, tigers, lions, bears, oh my, has turned out the way that it is completely by happenstance. It's complete chance of the universe. And that's just like, we just happen to be in a place where we're at the top of the food chain, because this podcast could be existing with two talking lions talking to each other, going like, man, do you remember that time when people like were talking about this like human Jesus, but like lions were ruling the earth at the time? Man, what a ridiculous notion, right? Like, I think that it's just complete happenstance that people, humanoids, happen to be the ones that are the one ruling the earth at this time. I think it's complete happenstance. And the fact of the matter is, I think it's a complete chance. Like cosmic chance has led us to where we are. And a lot of that isn't necessarily built on the chance or built on the notion of chance, but just the high unlikelihood that like the story of Jesus was existent, or that even that the notion of a God ruling over all of us is all that likely. Like, I just have a really hard time understanding that that's the events that have taken place that lead us to where we are now. Like that's kind of more or less where I'm at now. Like it's happenstance. Like there's nothing necessarily tying us to where we are now. I don't think a God would have necessarily led us to this destination. I think it's just more random chance. And if a God has had a hand in this, then I will be entirely considered wrong. But the way that things have landed they are now, like I think that people happen to be the dominant force on Earth, and we have not been given reason to believe otherwise.
Yeah. And that's like my ultimate horror show, you know? The thought that none of this means anything, that like I could just die and that's it, and just complete darkness. I mean, and that is, I'm going to die. You're going to die. And I mean, it's what in the book of John, I believe it said, without God, there's nothing. Like you can't do anything unless you have God. And I think that's kind of what it's getting at. There's this incredibly depressing book by Thomas Ligotti called Conspiracy Against the Human Race, which was the show True Detective. The first season was partly like based on this philosophy. And it's this theory of suffering and what we should do as a humanity. We should just hold hands, agree never to have children again, and just end it all, because it's not worth it. Like, what's the point of all this? Which, interestingly, like I was driving down Powell the other day, and there was this lady with all these black signs across the street from the high school, and I can't remember the high school's name right now. And it said, basically, it was protesting having children at all. It's like you shouldn't have kids. Across from a high school, like all these signs about you should stop having children. And I think there's a lot of people that believe that, which I think is sad. You know, I don't think that is something that we should think as a race. I think we have a really poor opinion of ourselves, actually. And I mean, we have done some terrible things, but we've also done some really beautiful things. But I guess my argument against what you're saying, Matt, is that I know personally, just from my own experience, that there's something inside of me that desires more than just what you're saying. And why would that exist if there wasn't something more? Like, why is it just like the horror of life? But I do feel there's something that is drawing me towards a greater spiritual reality than what you're saying. And I don't know why that would exist, why that I would want to fill this hole in my heart with something like that and be comforted by this without having a reason for why it's there.
Sure.
And I know that's kind of crazy, but I think, and I know when I feel like people, like when you have an actual experience with God, like, you know, it's not just fake and made up. And I do think there is something powerful about religion, specifically Christianity, and just Jesus's message about love and forgiveness, and just a God that would be willing to sacrifice so much to forgive a world that condemned him, which I think is a unique aspect of Christianity. And I think Christianity's been hijacked in so many ways by politics and by organized religion. And I find what Jesus actually preached and what he said and what his disciples said to be just profoundly beautiful and extremely comforting. And because Jesus didn't promise like an easy life, that was never what he said. And I always kind of like go back to that when I'm kind of like questioning myself. It's like no one ever said this was going to be easy, and especially not Jesus. So, but I do think there is sort of like this longing that each one of us has for something that isn't seeable. And I guess if it's not Christianity, then it's going to be something else. And I think that's it at the end of the day. It's like you're going to fill that hole in your heart with something. And I think looking to something that's beautiful and pure is better than looking towards something that's going to make you miserable at the end of the day, which is typically worldly things. So anyway.
I don't just necessarily disagree with that. I mean,
well, wow.
No, I mean, like, I have painted a bleak picture of what humanity is. And if anything, like, it has painted how I have viewed for a long time, up until recently, about like how I've felt of the world. And I hold strong to that. I think the world is shitty. I think ultimately the world is not necessarily a great place to inhabit.
And Christianity would agree with you. I mean, that's
but the way I see it, like, and the way that my wife have ultimately decided to see it, is that, like, we've been having the conversation about, like, what about kids? What about them? What about kids? What about bringing people into this world? What about bringing a person into this world? What's the point of that? And for up until like maybe the last like 2-3 months, I've been vehemently against it. I wanted kids when I was an active Christian. Like, that was a thing that I wanted. And after becoming a fairly adamant atheist, that was a thing that I just was not sure of. I was like, why would I want to bring another person into this world that is so awful, that treats people so terribly, that, like, a world that is just so hell-bent on making people miserable long term? And it really wasn't up until recently where I had decided otherwise, that, like, a huge part of life is struggle. And I don't think that's by accident. I don't necessarily think it's by means of some deity or anything, but I do think that, like, part of life is just struggle. It's meant to be that way because you have a full understanding and a full experience of knowing that, like, you need to work for the things that you want. You can't just have them handed to you. Like, and that's ultimately what's led to my belief, my understanding of the world as an atheist, that, like, I want kids. I don't even think I'm necessarily going to be, like, having kids and depositing them into a world beyond my life that is worth living. Like, I will potentially have kids, kid plural plus I don't know, um, whom I leave in a world that is awful. And I don't necessarily feel good about that part. But I think that there is something to be had in this world that is worth living for. Like, there are awful parts of this life to exist. And I talk about them and I think about them constantly. There are parts of this life that are just not worth living. People being awful to you, or just people being terrible in traffic, or just dealing with people in a fucking grocery store. Like, I bitch to my wife consistently about how terrible people are on a regular basis. But I don't necessarily think that means it's not worth having kids for.
Mm.
And that's only been a really recent revelation for me. Like, there was definitely a long stretch there. I've been with my wife for 6 years now. 3 of them, next year it'll be 4 years of marriage. So 7 years total if you're counting next year. But like this, it's a long time in which I was thinking, do I want to bring kids into this world where I think it's so awful? And for a long time I thought, no, I don't. I really don't. Like, I really don't know if I want to bring kids into a world like this. Like, do I want them to live through this kind of suffering? Like, but only recently I've just been thinking, like, yeah, it's hard. It's hard. Life is hard. The phrase I've been saying to myself is that being an adult is just hard. Being an adult in this world in the US at any rate is just hard.
It's hard everywhere. It's
Yeah.
hard for the
It's
lowliest
just
slug
hard.
to the smartest man. It's like,
Yeah, like,
life
it's
is
just
difficult.
yeah, it's entirely just so challenging. And like, in the most minute of ways, in which, like, I bitch to my wife about constantly, of like, this person in the grocery store had no regard for my existence, period, to like the more existential questions of like what it is to be alive. But after all that, I've come to the conclusion that I would rather have someone be brought into this world and get to enjoy an iota of happiness and joy than to not exist at all. And
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your assessment. I think at the end of the day, like, I do feel hopeful, and I think that this world is ultimately better than, or I think it's good. I think this world is worth
I think
living.
people are better than we give them credit for.
I don't
That's
know
what
about
I
that.
like to believe. I think that's what I personally try and believe. And like,
Yeah.
and I contradict myself on a constant basis every
Yeah.
day. But I like to try and believe that people are better than I give them credit for.
Well, I know, at least as far as like Christianity is concerned, I know that in religion in general, I mean, I think religion in a way is all about this question of suffering and why we suffer, like what the point of it is. And it's a question really that can't be answered by science. Like, I don't think that's something that's ever going to be something where like, oh, okay, well, we suffer because this, and maybe there is a reason that like scientifically that it's good to suffer or something, but it's not going to be something that's going to like be, you're not going to feel good about it, right? It's not going to be like, oh, okay, now I feel good about suffering because this scientist said it's because it helps my constitution. I don't know, but you know what I'm saying.
No, I mean, I think empirically speaking, like, if you want to try and come up with some evidence of, suffering being good for you, there might be some study by some person in some place about this argument. But I think ultimately, life is suffering, but you got to find reasons to exist otherwise. And I think that's ultimately what the argument is.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I think that that is what, yeah, you're right. That's what religion is. I think that that's what Christianity is. It's something that wants to essentially tell you that God loves you and it is worth it. And this life is really, like I said, really hard, but you know, like there is love and your creator does like you. You know, you're not like some like, I don't know. You're not in this world for no reason, and you're not hated or you know what's even worse than being hated is not even cared about. Like it doesn't mean anything. I don't feel like I'm doing a great job here, kind of defending religion, but
Oh, I mean, I disagree with you only in that, like, I think that's what life is. I think we're just like we're infinitesimal specks in the grand scheme of things, but ultimately you get to make your own meaning in this world, and it is ultimately what you decided to be, and how much importance you give to that is based on your own experience. And like in my own like current life experience, I don't necessarily think that I'm offering that much to the world in the grand scheme of things. Like if I were to evaluate my life experience and what I've offered to the world, I think it is lacking in a lot of ways. But maybe in having a child, man, woman, who gives a shit? But like in that offering another life to the world, maybe they will offer more to the world than I would. Maybe they have more to give than I do. And
yeah.
like I am but an infinitesimal speck in the grand scheme of things. And does that like hurt personally, and knowing that I mean nothing in the grand scheme of things, but like maybe my child or my great grandchild or further on down the line would? Maybe they mean something, but if my goal in all of this is just to allow them to exist in the first place, then who am I to stand in their way? Like,
Yeah. Well, this conversation is kind of reminding me of Nietzsche and his God is dead. Just what it means to the world if God is dead. And there was this great Reddit post that I found the other day. If I can find it, I'll read it. But essentially, like there's a pretty big misconception about what Nietzsche actually said about God is dead, and that it was something that he supported, and it wasn't necessarily. It was really just what it meant if in a world where God was dead, and what that means for us, essentially. Like, what does that mean for a humanity where God is no longer existent and we killed him? And essentially, he was saying it'd be a much worse place. I swore I saved this post, but now I can't find it, which is really bumming me out. But
Reddit is terrible in that way.
yeah, I thought I saved it, but apparently I didn't, which was just sucky.
But yeah, I mean, I live every day with the knowledge that maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm incorrect in assuming that there is a God in this world, there's some deity in this world that is watching over us. And my lack of belief in this deity is pushing me more towards a depth of hell that I am not expecting. I like to believe that we just end up being worm food, but you know that's just the circle of life. But if I'm wrong, well, then I'm wrong. Like I have not been to prove I'm wrong, in my view, but maybe I am. And if I am wrong, well, oops, you know, like I I can apologize all I want, but that'll be something to deal with my maker when the time comes. But As it stands right now, the way I see it is I got to live my life the way that I see fit. I got to live my life the way I see fit with my spouse, the person I've chosen to live my life with. And I want to bring children to this world. Like that's something I've decided. You know, it was a thing that I previously wasn't sure on. Now I am. And like, and that terrifies the shit out of me because maybe I am wrong. If I'm wrong, then I'm bringing my kids or kids plural, I don't know, into a world of ultimate suffering. And in that case, that's double oops, in which I feel ultimately way more guilty than I'd like to admit. But like I just think that we gotta live our life day to day as best as we can. And I can't spend every day thinking whether or not like I am living my existence in accordance to some deity or my kids are going to live their life in accordance to some deity. I'm going to have kids. I'm going to raise them in a way that I think is right. I want them to try and make the world a better place ultimately in the long term, God or not. And I want humanity to succeed. Like I don't want humanity to fail, and I think I'm going to try and raise my kids in accordance to that mentality. So,
I mean, I think too a lot of this, and this is something that Paul, talks about a lot. Apostle Paul, just what you're saying about wanting the world to be better, or you feel dissatisfied, or like it's not worth it, or you're not, or I'm not saying you're saying this, but if you're not good enough, I think that's specifically what Jesus addresses. And essentially like what Paul, said is that the law, referring to the Bible, is good, but it's not going to make you happy. It's a relationship with Jesus that's going to make you happy. And I don't think that the law isn't just about what the Bible, the law refers to every law, every rules that you set up for yourself in this world, that you think that you're going to climb this ladder and become a good person, or you're going to change the world, or like if you're not doing something, then you're not going to be happy if you don't get this specific thing. And essentially what Jesus says, and he says that he loves you, and it's not about what you achieve in that regard. And that's a really hard pill for me to swallow, and it's a hard pill to understand, because as a person, like I want to like judge myself against some sort of impossible metric that I'm never going to be able to obtain. And I want to just be fully there, where my faith comes out of a knowledge that I am loved, not that I have to like build myself up to get to a certain level where God will love me. And I think, I don't know if this is specifically addressing what you're talking about, but I think there's been a great disservice that's happened with the church, where people think that by being a Christian, you're good, or if you do these sets of things that you're good. And that's just a recipe for hurt. And I think that it's really difficult to do, but just to know that you're loved, I think that's really what it comes down to, that there's a sense of hope, and this world is worth living in. And really, I think at the end of the day, it's about having just a relationship with God and relationship with other people. And this is just my experience. Just, I know before, when I was at my worst, when I was at the most depressed, and like I didn't know what my life was going to be, and I felt like, why am I even living in this world? Like it's not worth it. Like I'm just so sad. And it was really forming a relationship with other people that really helped me like get out of the funk I was in. And I think that, I mean, those are the two things that God really called you to do, was to have a relationship with him and to have a relationship with other people. And I think that's, at the end of the day, like that's what as a Christian, that's what it is about. really, is to have a relationship with Jesus. And by having that relationship with Jesus, though life still sucks, like it sucks. You're right. The world sucks. It's like life is suffering. Like, I mean, I think that's a Buddhist concept, right? But the way to get out of this, the way to find joy is to have hope. And God gives you that hope and that joy and that love. And nothing in this world, unfortunately, is going to give that to you, at least on a permanent basis. Not your wife, not your kids, not your job, not the new Zelda game. I don't know. Nothing is going to give you that permanent sense of joy. And whether it's real or not, I do think there is something to that. Like there is something that it gives you that nothing else in this world is going to be able to give you. And that's like a sense of community. That's a sense of purpose. That's a sense of, well, I guess I was going to say the reason why you're here, which is the same as purpose. But whether you believe or not, I think there is a reason to believe. Else you have like the yawning abyss that's calling you to it, and like you aren't able to do anything without a reason for being, unfortunately. So, and yeah, you can make that reason for yourself. And I've watched plenty of videos and read plenty of articles and stuff about how you need to make your purpose for yourself. But I don't know. That's just my rambling for right now. Take it or leave it.
Oh, I mean, I think we've both been rambling for the better part of an hour. But I mean, like, I think that, yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think where we both end up lying is like not lying, but like where we end up is like why we exist. And on my end, it's that I hope that we're existing for just for the sake of existing. And I think on your end, it's we hope to exist for the sake of a purpose. And
yeah, I mean,
there's a reason versus a not reason.
And I guess my argument would ultimately end up too, because I do believe what you just said. I think a purpose without a purpose, you'll just live a shorter life. I mean, I know like if you ever heard like Viktor Frankl, I think I've talked to you about him before, just that the people that tended to live through like the concentration camps during World War II were people that had some sort of hope about getting out of the situation or some sort of purpose for continuing on. The people that give up tended to die, really, like they didn't make it.
Sure.
And that's something that's, I mean, like addressed with, obviously with Christianity. But I guess the ultimate thing, the reason why I believe is that I just have this overwhelming sense in my heart that it is true. And
sure.
I think that to have this faith, you have to have some sort of feeling inside of yourself that love exists outside of humans, that there is love, an inherent love in the universe, and it's just not an emptiness, a vacuum. And to me, stories and these constant stories that we have about the hero or the villain, like his heart growing 5 times, or the courage of the hero to just this love beating out the vacuum. And I think that's what it is to me. I feel like there is love in the universe that's beyond just humanity, and that love is reaching out to us. And yeah, so there you go.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that ultimately that's where I think that's where our argument lies. Like, however, like minute it might be, is that it's where that sense of purpose, that sense of love comes from. It's whether that sense of love and purpose comes from an outside source, or whether that sense of love and purpose comes from within people or not. And I don't know which one is necessarily right or wrong. Like, I don't necessarily believe, like, I believe that I'm right, but that doesn't mean that I'm right. Your sense of purposeness could be very right, in terms of like what we have been talking about. And if I'm wrong, well, that, like I said before, that's a big oopsie. It's like, well, oops. Like, I wish I'd chosen differently. But the fact of the matter is we just don't know until the end. And the people who are on the other side, whether they be, alive, frolicking in eternity, or just being dead and buried, they know the answers, but we don't. And like, outside of that, we don't really know. Like, we can discuss what we think we know, but like, I think ultimately you and I, based on our discussion, like, result in the same place. Is just based on where that journey ends, more than anything.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would somewhat agree with that. But yeah, I think that there is more to this world than we know. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, that seems
I'm not
as good
saying
a
I'm not
place
saying
as
that
any.
you don't. I'm sorry. I mean, that was kind of a broad statement.
No, no. I mean, I think that seems as good of a place as any to end the podcast, but only because I think we've come to a point that seems appropriate to end on. But unless you have any other, in that we had talked about keeping the podcast relatively short today. In
I
our
knew it was
promise
going
of
to go
that,
longer than half an hour.
we've gone long past what we thought would would think would be short. But yeah, unless you have any other thoughts in the matter, I think we're at a pretty good stopping point. But
yeah, no, I don't think I do. Just that I feel like I just know, so.
yeah. And I think I think that's where we both lie, is that we think we just know. And whether we be right or wrong, you'll be able to let me know on the other end if I'm wrong. I won't be able to let you know on the other end if we're wrong.
I don't know
if
if
I'm
that's,
wrong.
yeah, I don't know.
But
I
regardless
guess
of
it
that being
depends
the
on
case,
what you think happens to consciousness after you die, which I don't really have a great understanding of heaven, so I'm not gonna. I don't understand heaven. I don't understand. It's like something that I can't understand. So I don't think I'm
No.
supposed to understand it.
No, and I can't either. So short of having an understanding of that, yeah, I think we've had a good discussion about just our religious beliefs and where we are right now. I think that in keeping this episode relatively trim in terms of us in our normal circumstances, do you have any passing or any closing thoughts on our discussion today?
No.
No.
No, not today. No, I mean, I think if I was gonna start on any tangent, it would end up us going like another 20 minutes. So I'll just say no, I don't.
No, I agree. I think we've ended on a strong point. So that being said, I want to thank everyone for being here for the 29th episode of the podcast.
Yeah, this one hardly qualifies as Nerds of the North. It's more like,
yeah, like that had nothing to do with what we normally talk about. It's kind of bananas what we ended up talking about a religion, which could have some real ramifications in the future. But
I don't know. I feel like we're fine. I mean, you're in Texas, I'm in Portland, so I feel like we both equally be affected.
Yeah, I mean, we're very opposite in terms of that. But I do want to thank you all for joining us today. for this episode of the Nerds in the North podcast. And I hope you join us for the next episode.
We'll talk about Hawkeye.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll be talking about Hawkeye rather than our religious musics. So
I know this was fun. Joining us. This was fun. Yeah.
And hope you join us for the next episode of the podcast, episode number 30. Next time we record, whichever that may be.
Yep.
Yeah, and I would say have a good night, and we will see you next time.
Yeah. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.